Morning. In the beginning of my talk, I would like to express my sincere thanks to the organizers of the PETRA conference for making it possible for me to present. I will focus on the university professor on the university professors in their roles as literary translators. Taking my examples from retranslations of children's literature classics. I will start with a short explanation as to why I wanted to focus on this topic. 2 years ago, working on a paper titled Remembering Literary Translators and Analyzing Obituaries of 35 renowned translators working from and into Polish, I found out that all translators, with just one exception, combined the translatorial activity with other jobs or roles. In most cases, literary translators were also, or maybe even primarily, writers, poets, or playwrights, and 1/3 devoted themselves to academic work. Of course, there were also other professions present, including an insurance agent who translated over 300 authors from Polish into German, and who approached his literary work as a hobby initially, cultivated in free time and on business trips, the illustrious Carroll. I think it is quite easy to see how literary translation enhances an author's own creative work. Let me quote Czesław Miłosz, awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1980, who said, "I have always translated a lot from many languages, and I have always learned a lot. My poetry would emaciate were it not nourished by ever new images, even, I would say, by new civilizations, which he obviously found in translations." While the author's motivation for translating seems to be quite evident, one could wonder what makes professors, or taken more broadly, university lecturers, translate. I will try to answer this question on the basis of translatorial paratexts, or the verbal and visual materials surrounding and presenting published translations, which are able to provide a unique insight into the translator's work and are described as methodologically indispensable for contemporary translation research. This is true regardless of whether they appear within the book or outside it, as both the study of paratexts, for example, prefaces, dedications, notes, afterwards, and epitexts, diaries, letters, interviews, journal articles, and so on, accompanying translations, provides valuable information on translation and translators. So far, paratextual data related to literary translation have been studied in terms of their relevance for historical translation research, their impact on the agency and visibility of the translator, their connection with broader cultural context, in particular the ideology-serving role of paratextual mediation, and self-promotional discourse of literary translators in the printed media. Researchers either analyze paratexts in general or focus more closely on their specific forms, such as footnotes or epitext. A particularly well-researched paratextual genre are prefaces, which have featured as the main subject of several papers, some of which are listed on the slide. In the present paper, I would like to focus on paratexts offered by 3 Polish translators, Elżbieta Tabakowska, Eliza Pieciul-Karmińska, and Bogusława Sochańska. Elżbieta Tabakowska is the author of the 9th Polish translation of Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Eliza Pieciul-Karmińska, the author of the 3rd Polish translation of Hoffmann's The Nutcracker and the Mouse King, and Bogusława Sochańska, the author of the 1st Polish translation of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales and stories directly from Danish. I decided to focus on a very specific type of translation, retranslation, because it challenges the validity of the previous translation and as such is more likely to elicit translators' response in the form of paratext. I will focus on the translator's motivation, on the meta-telos of their work, on a new translation? Is it more personal, undertaking a challenge, translating for the child within themselves or in their own environment? Or more professional, providing readers with a new, more faithful version, possibly responding to the changing concepts of childhood and the child reader? The second question would refer to their preferred translation strategies. Are they more inclined to represent cultural otherness, acting as ambassadors of the source language culture, or do they want to fit in the literary system and expectations of the receiving culture, producing a text consistent with the dominating norm of this culture? And thirdly, how does the scholarly translation of a children's classic mediate between adult and child interests? There is a risk that a concern for scholarly accuracy may compromise the translator's approach to the child reader, or indeed to the text's read-aloud qualities for readers of any age, as Gillian Levy points out. I will start with a translation by Elżbieta Tabakowska, a cognitive linguist and translation scholar, founder and former director of the UNESCO Chair for Translation Studies and Intercultural Communication in Krakow, a translator of Norman Davies' books into Polish. I will focus on one paratext, the Afterword to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, and two epitexts, an interview with the translator and an academic paper, Where is Your iPad, Alice? In her paratext, one can see that translating Alice was not an accidental choice. In the interview, the translator admits, there is a book, a kind of leitmotif of my academic activity. This is Alice in Wonderland. My MA thesis was on Alice in Wonderland. My PhD was on Alice in Wonderland. And in a very boring postdoctoral degree, I included examples from Alice in Wonderland. From her paper, we learned that the fact she was a professor was crucial in her decision to retranslate. For someone like me, who had hitherto approached Carroll's English Alice and all Polish Alices only as a material for linguistic deliberations and exercises in translation critique, the offer to face the original text from the position of a translator had to be an irresistible one, but it was no mean challenge either. Further in the paper, Elżbieta Tabakowska asks about the criteria that Alice number 9 needs to meet and devotes the article to describing an array of features that have to be taken into account when translating. Her intended audience were both children and adults, and she reveals in the Afterword that she had consciously used different age-appropriate solutions to interest 3 generations, grandparents, parents, and children. Was she successful? In a review that she quotes in her article, her version was described as very modern and up-to-date, but still requiring a knowledgeable reader, an opinion she herself seems to share. But is it a drawback? Not if we consider the mission which the translator believes every adult, including the adult translator, should accomplish, the mission of giving children only what represents a high artistic level, what goes against infantilism, global megaculture, cultural neutralization. Children should be spoken to in an ordinary everyday language, not necessarily devoid of difficult words. However, there is a price to be paid for this approach. First of all, it may not be feasible. And secondly, as the already quoted reviewer put it, although the dialogues sound very modern and are not artificial, she cannot imagine that an average child will be able to read the translation. Unfortunately, the requirement not to compromise the high artistic level of the original seems to clash with the necessity of entering into a dialogue with the child. Interestingly, we can see an almost identical situation in the context of German-Polish translation, when Eliza Pieciul-Karmińska's third Polish retranslation of Hoffmann's work, The Nutcracker and the Mouse King, is concerned. The translator is a professor at Poznań University, known in particular for her translation of the Grimm's fairy tales and publications on the theory and practice of German-Polish translation in the context of children's literature. She has her own Facebook page, Rumpelstück, devoted to fairy tales. I will focus on one paratext, the translator's Afterword, and two epitexts, two academic papers on Polish adaptations and retranslations of the Nutcracker. The meta-telos of the translator's work was to produce a faithful rendition, free from erroneous interpretations of the earlier translators who impoverished the language of the original, making it standardized, always correct, devoid of ambiguity and complexity, humor, irony, and detailed description, who explained everything that seemed illogical or unclear in the original, added diminutives and didactic messages whenever possible, censored improper elements, and on the whole, manifested paternalism and superiority of the adult translator over the young reader. The translator scholar is perfectly aware of what she translates. This includes being faithful to the original, and this means searching for explanation if some passages are unclear or illogical, instead of correcting or omitting them. It also means writing a text that may be interpreted in multiple ways, just like the original is, and interest adult as well as child readers. Was this approach successful? In the same paper, the translators quotes a review which finds fault with the text as being too difficult to be read aloud, which the reviewer ascribes to excessive faithfulness to the original, despite the fact that the translator clearly explained his strategy in the Afterword. The problem here might arise from the fact that this is only the third retranslation of the classic, and Hoffmann's work is still considered one-dimensionally in the target culture, as a book for children only. In the case of Alice, so much has been written about it being two books in one for adults, the other for children, that it is taken for granted that the translation should appeal to both age groups. In the case of the Nutcracker, the translator makes an attempt at changing the popular reception of the text in the target culture to make it clear that the text has much to offer to the adult reader as well. When we compare the reception of both translations, we can see that although they originated from two different sets of assumptions, the result seems to be the same, a visible tension between being faithful to the text and being loyal to the child reader. It is also interesting to see that the Afterword is written in a very similar way to the 2014 paper. It is of course much shorter, but presents the new retranslation in the context of the earlier Polish versions using very similar style, although the communication situation is different. In the Afterword, it is the translator who writes to her readers. In the paper, the scholar who writes to other scholars. This might suggest that Eliza Pieciul-Karmińska perceives both audiences in a similar way and consciously combines both roles, the role of the translator and the role of the scholar. They intertwine with each other and are both subordinated to a third role, that of a popularizer of German culture, of German literature, who sees the importance of writing paratexts for most, if not all, of her translations, and contextualizing her translatorial work in research papers. I will now move on to the third example, the first Polish translation of Andersen's fairy tales and stories directly from Danish. Its author is Bogusława Sochańska, the director of the Danish Cultural Institute in Poland, former Poznań University lecturer in the field of Danish language, literature, and translation, and author of a number of articles on Andersen's life and work, as well as on the Polish reception of his fairy tales. I will focus on the translator's Afterword and two academic papers in which she discusses the reception and translation of Andersen's fairy tales and stories in Poland. When reading the Afterword, we can see that, unlike the two other translators presented before, this one clearly privileges the child reader. So let's read aloud to children in particular, because it is children who are the most important. This is the quote, and because fairy tales are best understood when read aloud and listened to. What does it look like in practice? The meta-telos of the translator's work was to produce a translation faithful to the original and accounting for the traditional reception of the text. However, both assumptions seem to be incompatible with each other. The translator admits that it took her 3 years to find a publisher for a new translation of Andersen's fairy tales and stories. She says that the main hindrance was publishers' conviction that a new version was not necessary since we can boast the best foreign rendition of Andersen's fairy tales. Someone once wrote so, nobody knows why, and the opinion lives on, as does the adjective canonical. In fact, this best translation, not necessarily directly from Danish, often seriously misinterpreted and impoverished Andersen's work. The meta-telos of Sochańska's work was to convince their readers how different the Andersen they remember from childhood is from the original, and help Polish researchers to re-evaluate the reception of this extraordinary writer. She wanted to achieve this by fine-tuning the Polish retranslation to reflect the original style of Andersen's narration consistent with his intentions, and to enable the child to find an imagination similar to her own, and the adult reader to enjoy his humor and beautiful language, and finally discover the addressees of fairy tales. At least as important, that the adult addressee of fairy tales is at least as important for Andersen as the child reader. Sochańska points out that Andersen was pigeonholed as a children's writer everywhere where poor translations were published, and these prevailed. It was also true for the Polish language. First of all, translating Andersen requires an excellent command of Danish so that the translator can understand the language in general, as well as the specificities of his writing style with all its nuances, humor, ambiguity, implied meaning, and subtle allusion. Here, again, the tension between being faithful to the original and producing a translation that reads well is apparent. This time, it is not about unfavorable reviews, but about the process of editing. The translator gives an example of a passage in which she had to compromise her ideals, but in hindsight, regrets it. Today, I would not give in to editorial changes, as my original translation was more faithful to the original and closer to spoken language, and the final passage exuded dramatic tension. Iwaszkiewicz's translation is a reworking of the original and omits a device that is important in Andersen's style, interjection. If the writer had wished so, he would have written ordinarily, yet after the semicolon he interjects in a certain passage. She finishes her reflection stating, a question occurs, so what that a translation reads well if it depletes the original text, which in an interesting way seems to respond to the critical remarks present in the reviews quoted in the first 2 case studies of this paper. Summing up, there are some similarities in the 3 examples analyzed in this paper. First of all, the meta-telos in all cases was restoring faithfulness to the original text, a motivation closely linked to the fact that all translators in question were primarily scholars, giving vent to their fascination for respectively English, German, and Danish language, literature, and culture. Secondly, they all chose foreignization as the translation strategy that would best correspond with their assumptions, not hesitating to challenge the norms and expectations of the receiving culture and change the prevalent view of the author or idea of writing for children among the Polish audience, although this approach was met with objections and reluctance on the part of reviewers and editors. Thirdly, the already quoted concern for scholarly accuracy seems to have negatively affected the narrative communication with the child, despite the translator's declarations or efforts to the contrary. Clearly, translation, especially when classics are concerned, involves solving multiple dilemmas, and the one connected with scholarly accuracy and readability or accessibility to the child reader is particularly difficult to overcome. Thank you for your attention.